A billionaire followed his maid through the city streets one night, convinced she was stealing from him. He was wealthy, powerful, untouchable. She was young, silent, invisible. Every evening she left his mansion at exactly 6 p.m., carrying plastic bags that seemed heavier each day. Items were going missing: bread from the pantry, canned food, old books. And one night, suspicion got the better of him. He followed her, expecting to catch her selling his property, expecting proof she was a thief. But what he discovered under that highway bridge didn't just shock him. It shattered him and rebuilt him from the ground up. This isn't just a story about a billionaire and his maid. It's about what happens when you stop seeing people as what they do for you and start seeing them for who they really are. It's about the moment you realize that the person you judged as worthless might be worth more than everything you own. This is the story of David Smith and Anita, and the night that taught him the greatest lesson of his life. A lesson in humanity he would never forget. Everyone in the city knew the name David Smith. Tech billionaire, self-made, cold, brilliant, ruthless in business, precise in everything. His penthouse overlooking the harbor wasn't just a home, it was a statement. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble floors so polished you could see your reflection. Furniture that cost more than most people earned in a year, but if you looked closely you'd notice something strange. For all its luxury, the place felt empty. No family photos, no warmth, just expensive silence. Inside this glass palace, there was one person who moved like a ghost: his maid, Anita. Anita was always early, always quiet. She wore the same black and white uniform every day, hair pulled back in a neat bun, eyes that never quite met his. She cleaned the windows until they disappeared, folded his towels into perfect squares, and prepared meals he barely touched. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then just 2 words: "Yes, sir." David barely noticed her. She was furniture, part of the routine. There one moment, gone the next. But lately, something had changed. It started small. One Tuesday evening, David opened the pantry looking for the sourdough bread he'd bought over the weekend. Gone. He frowned but said nothing. Maybe he'd eaten it and forgotten. Thursday, 3 cans of soup disappeared. The expensive organic kind he kept stocked for emergencies he never had. By the following week, he noticed books missing from the shelf in his study. Old paperbacks he'd collected but never read. Then half a loaf of bread, a bag of rice, more canned goods. David wasn't the type to ignore patterns. Patterns meant something, and this pattern pointed to one person. He started watching her. Not obviously, David Smith didn't do obvious, but he paid attention now. He noticed how Anita arrived each morning with an old canvas bag empty. How she worked her usual silent routine, never taking breaks, never complaining. And how every evening at exactly 6 p.m. she walked out the door with 2 plastic bags, heavy, straining against her thin arms. What was in those bags? One Friday afternoon, David stood by his office window, watching the street below. His mind wasn't on the quarterly reports or the merger talks. It was on her, on those bags, on the missing items. At 5:45 p.m., he heard her footsteps in the hallway. Soft, deliberate. He glanced at his watch, then moved to where he could see the entrance without being seen. There she was, black and white uniform. 2 plastic bags, obviously full. She adjusted the straps, checked something in her pocket, then walked out the service entrance. David's jaw tightened. How long had this been going on? What was she doing with his things? Selling them? And why did someone so quiet, so submissive, think she could steal from him? He grabbed his car keys, pulled on a dark jacket, and headed for the private elevator. His driver would ask questions. Tonight, he didn't want questions. Tonight, he would follow her himself. David kept his distance, 3 cars back, headlights dim. His black Mercedes blended into the evening traffic, just another vehicle in the city's endless flow. Ahead, Anita walked with steady determination, those plastic bags swinging at her sides. She didn't take a taxi, didn't wait for a bus, she just walked. Block after block, her pace never slowed. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Where was she going? To some second-hand shop, a fence who bought stolen goods. Maybe she had a buyer waiting, someone who paid cash for pantry items and old books. The neighborhoods changed as she walked. The glass towers and clean sidewalks of downtown gave way to older buildings, cracked pavement, graffiti-tagged walls. Street vendors packed up their stalls. Groups of men stood on corners, watching everyone who passed. David had forgotten these parts of the city existed, or maybe he'd chosen not to remember. Anita turned down a narrow street lined with broken streetlights. David slowed the car, hanging back now, not wanting to be obvious. She walked past a shuttered convenience store, past abandoned lots filled with trash and weeds. The bags looked heavier now, pulling at her shoulders, but she didn't stop, didn't rest. The buildings grew more desperate. Crumbling apartments with laundry hanging from fire escapes, boarded-up storefronts, people sitting on steps with nowhere else to go. This was the part of the city that politicians promised to fix and then forgot about. David's chest felt tight. What kind of market operated in a place like this? Anita crossed through an empty lot where streetlights barely reached. David pulled to the curb, cutting his engine. He could see her silhouette ahead, still moving. The sound of traffic grew louder. The highway overhead, concrete pillars holding up the endless stream of cars above. Then she stopped. David leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. Anita stood beneath the highway overpass, where the noise was deafening and the shadows were thick. No shops here, no buildings, just concrete and darkness and the thundering sound of vehicles passing overhead. This made no sense. He opened his car door quietly, stepping out into the cool evening air. His expensive shoes crunched on broken glass. He stayed in the shadows, watching. And then he saw movement, small figures emerging from the darkness beneath the bridge. Children. David's breath caught in his throat. What was happening here? They came from everywhere. From behind the concrete pillars, from cardboard shelters tucked against the walls, from the shadows David hadn't even noticed were there. Children, maybe 15 of them. Some looked no older than 6 or 7. Others were teenagers, but small, malnourished, wearing clothes that hung off their thin frames. Their faces lit up when they saw Anita. "Teacher," one small girl called out, running forward. "Miss Anita," a boy shouted, his smile bright despite the dirt on his face. David pressed himself against a pillar, watching. His heart pounded in his chest, but not from fear, from something else, something he couldn't name yet. Anita set the bags down on a flattened piece of cardboard, her makeshift classroom. The children gathered around her in a semicircle, sitting cross-legged on the ground. She knelt beside the bags and began unpacking. The bread, his bread. She tore it into pieces and handed them out, 1 piece per child. They took them carefully, reverently, like they were receiving something precious. The canned soup. She opened 3 cans with a rusty opener and poured them into plastic bowls. The children passed the bowls around, sharing, taking small sips to make it last. David's throat tightened. These weren't stolen goods being sold. This was food being given to children who looked like they hadn't eaten all day. Then Anita pulled out the books, those old paperbacks from his shelf. She also had pencils, a few notebooks with worn covers, some pages torn from magazines with pictures and words. She held up a book, pointing to the title. "Today we practice reading," she said, her voice stronger than David had ever heard it. "Who wants to start?" Hands shot up, eager, desperate to learn. For the next hour, David watched from the darkness. He watched Anita point to words, sounding them out slowly. He watched her kneel beside a boy who struggled, her hand guiding his as he formed letters in a notebook. He watched her face, radiant, alive, nothing like the silent ghost who cleaned his penthouse. This was who she really was, not invisible, not quiet, powerful. When the lesson ended, she divided the remaining food. The children thanked her, hugging her before disappearing back into their hiding places. Anita kept only a single piece of bread for herself. She sat on the cardboard, eating slowly, looking tired but content. David stumbled back to his car and sat in the driver's seat. His hands were shaking. He thought of his penthouse, the food rotting in his refrigerator because he ordered too much, the closet full of clothes he never wore, the rooms he never entered, the waste, the emptiness. And here she was, giving away what little she had, feeding children with his scraps, teaching them to read under a bridge because no one else would. Who was the real thief here? David put his head in his hands, and for the first time in years he wept. David drove home in silence. The city lights blurred past his windows, but he saw none of it. All he could see were those children's faces, their eager hands reaching for bread, their bright eyes when Anita opened a book. Back in his penthouse, he didn't turn on the lights. He just stood by the window, staring out at the glittering skyline. Somewhere out there, beneath a highway bridge, children were sleeping on cardboard. And Anita, his maid, the woman he'd suspected of theft, was probably walking home to whatever small room she rented with her meager salary. Sleep was impossible. At 2 a.m. David sat at his computer searching. Street children and the name of the district where he'd followed her. The results made his stomach turn. Thousands of homeless children in the city. Abandoned, orphaned, runaways from abusive homes. Most couldn't read. Most didn't go to school. They survived by begging, stealing, or worse. He found a local news article from 2 years ago. A small mention of a young woman teaching street children under the overpass. No name given, but it had to be her. 2 years. She'd been doing this for 2 years. David stood and walked through his penthouse. Really looked at it for the first time in months. The kitchen gleamed untouched. He opened the refrigerator, fresh vegetables wilting, expensive cheeses going moldy, bottles of imported water he never drank. The pantry overflowed with food he'd forgotten he'd bought. In his bedroom, the walk-in closet held rows of suits, shirts still in their packaging, shoes he'd worn once. 3 watches sat in a drawer, each worth more than Anita probably earned in a year. He thought of her worn shoes, the way her uniform hung loose on her thin frame, how she never asked for anything, never complained, just worked silently and then disappeared at 6 p.m. to feed children who had nothing. She'd been taking his excess, food that would have gone to waste, books collecting dust, and turning it into hope, into meals, into education, into a future for kids the world had forgotten. And he'd thought she was stealing. David sank onto his bed, the question circling in his mind like a vulture. Who was the real thief here? The man hoarding more than he could ever use? Or the woman giving away what was never really his to begin with? Morning came too slowly. David sat at the breakfast table, untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. He'd rehearsed what to say a dozen times, but the words still felt inadequate. At 7:00 a.m. he heard her key in the door. Footsteps in the hallway. The familiar routine beginning. She'd go to the kitchen first, start preparing his breakfast, avoid eye contact like always. "Anita," he called out before she could disappear, "please sit down." The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then slowly, cautiously, she appeared in the doorway. Her face was careful, guarded. Employees didn't sit at the boss's table. Something was wrong. "Sir, if I've done something." "Sit," he said again, gentler this time. "Please." She lowered herself into the chair across from him, hands folded in her lap. Her eyes stayed down, waiting for the blow. David took a breath. "I followed you last night." Her body went rigid. The color drained from her face. This was it, termination, maybe worse. She'd been caught stealing, and men like David Smith didn't forgive theft. "I saw the children," he continued. "I saw what you did, the food, the teaching, everything." Anita's lips trembled, but she said nothing. "Why?" David asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why didn't you just ask me for help?" She looked up then, eyes glistening. People like you don't help people like me, sir. They fire us for overstepping. That's not what I'm asking. He leaned forward. Why do you do it at all? Those children, that bridge, why? Anita's hands clenched together. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I had a brother, Marcus. He was 8 years old when my mother died. We had nothing, no family, no home. I tried to keep him safe, but I was only 12. I didn't know how. Tears rolled down her cheeks now. She didn't wipe them away. One winter he got sick. I couldn't afford medicine, couldn't even afford food. I came back to our spot under a different bridge and found him. Cold, alone, forgotten. David felt his chest constrict. I couldn't save him, Anita continued, her voice stronger now. But maybe I can save them. Maybe Marcus didn't die for nothing if I can keep other children from ending up like he did. David saw her clearly for the first time. Not a maid, not a servant, a warrior fighting a battle no one else would fight. Let me help you, he said quietly. David blinked. Of all the responses he'd expected, that wasn't one of them. No. Anita wiped her eyes and straightened in her chair. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Smith. I really do. But no. I don't understand. David shook his head. I can fund it properly. Get you real supplies, a proper space, more volunteers. We could expand to other areas, help hundreds of children instead of just 15. Why would you refuse? Because it won't be mine anymore. The words hung between them. Anita continued, her voice steady now. I've worked for wealthy people my whole life. I've seen how they help. They write checks and feel good about themselves. They take photos for their social media. They turn suffering into stories they tell at dinner parties. She looked directly at him. And then they disappear when the cameras are gone. I wouldn't do that, David protested. Maybe not intentionally, but it would happen. She folded her hands. Those children know me. They trust me. I sit with them in the dirt. I share their food. When I teach them to read, it's not charity, it's family. If you get involved, I become just another employee. They become your project. And projects get abandoned when they stop being interesting. David felt the words like a physical blow. When you have nothing, Anita said quietly, your dignity is everything. That work, those children, they're mine, my purpose. My way of making Marcus's death mean something. I need to do this my way, even if it's slower, even if it's harder. She stood, smoothing her uniform. I'll give you 2 weeks' notice. I can't work here anymore, not after last night, but I'm grateful you followed me. At least now I know you see me as a person. That's more than most employers ever do. David sat frozen as she walked to the door. Anita. She turned. You're right, he said, the admission painful but necessary. About all of it, you're absolutely right. She gave him a small, sad smile. Thank you for understanding, Mr. Smith. As the door closed behind her, David remained at the table, stunned, humbled, and feeling something he hadn't felt in years, genuine respect for another human being. Maybe even something deeper than that. 2 months passed like a slow winter. David hired a new cleaning service, professional, efficient. They came twice a week, worked in teams, and left everything spotless. He never learned their names. They were exactly what he thought he wanted, invisible. But the penthouse felt wrong now. Too quiet, too empty. He'd catch himself listening for footsteps that never came, for the soft sound of someone humming while they worked. Anita had never hummed, but somehow her silence had been better than this hollow perfection. Work became mechanical. Meetings blurred together. Profits climbed. Investors celebrated. David went through the motions, signed the papers, made the decisions. But at night, alone in his glass tower, he felt like a stranger in his own life. Meanwhile, across the city, Anita had found work at a small bakery. The pay was less, the hours longer, but the owner let her take home day-old bread. Every evening at 6:00 p.m. she still made the same walk, same route, same bridge, same children. But things had changed there too. Somehow, supplies appeared, new notebooks, pencils that weren't broken, canned goods and blankets that Anita hadn't purchased. She asked the children where they came from. A man dropped them off, one boy said they were from a friend. Anita suspected, but she never asked. She just used what was given and continued her work. David never went back to the bridge, but he made sure the supplies kept coming. Anonymous donations through a local charity. Cash drops in unmarked envelopes. He told himself he was respecting her boundaries, helping her way, not his. But the truth was simpler. He missed her, missed the quiet presence that had made his empty home feel less empty. One Thursday evening, David sorted through his mail. Bills, business proposals, an invitation in a cream-colored envelope hand-delivered. He opened it. "You are warmly invited to a night of hope, celebrating 2 years of light under the bridge. Join us in honoring the children and the teacher who never gave up on them." At the bottom, in simple handwriting, "Your presence would mean everything. Anita." David held the invitation, his hands trembling slightly. She'd invited him, after everything, after he'd followed her, suspected her, tried to take over her mission. She still wanted him there. He looked at the date, this Saturday, 2 days away. For the first time in months, David smiled. David arrived as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He parked a block away and walked, wearing simple jeans and a plain jacket. No designer labels tonight, no armor. The bridge looked different. String lights hung between the concrete pillars, casting a warm glow over everything. Colorful paper decorations fluttered in the evening breeze. Someone had laid out blankets and cardboard mats in neat rows, creating a makeshift gathering space. And there were people, so many people. Parents, grandparents, neighbors from the surrounding streets. The children were dressed in their best clothes, faces scrubbed clean, hair combed. David recognized some of them from that first night. They looked healthier now, brighter. He stayed at the back, leaning against a pillar where shadows would hide him. A woman stepped forward, holding a little girl's hand. "My daughter can write her own name now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Because of Miss Anita, for the first time she believes she can have a future." Other parents spoke. A father whose son was learning to read. A grandmother whose grandson now dreamed of going to school. Each story was a testament to quiet, relentless love. Then Anita stepped forward, and the crowd erupted in applause. She looked different too, confident, her head held high. She wore a simple yellow dress and her smile was radiant. "2 years ago," she began, "I started with just 1 loaf of bread and 3 children. I thought it was impossible. I thought I wasn't enough." She paused, looking at the faces before her. "But someone once told me that you don't need to be rich to make a difference. You just need to care enough to try." Anita's eyes swept the crowd. "I also want to thank an anonymous friend who believed in us, who sent supplies when we needed them most, who never asked for credit or recognition but just helped. Whoever you are," her voice caught slightly, "thank you. You reminded me that I don't have to do this alone." Her gaze drifted to the back, to the shadows where David stood. Their eyes met across the crowd. No surprise, no shock, just recognition, understanding. Maybe she'd known all along. David felt his throat tighten. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. Anita smiled, small, knowing, grateful. And in that moment, everything changed. The celebration wound down as families gathered their children and said their goodbyes. David waited until the crowd thinned, then walked forward. Anita was folding blankets, humming softly to herself. "It was me," he said quietly. She turned unsurprised. "I know. The supplies, the donations. I wanted to help, your way, not mine." Anita set down the blanket. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were right about everything." David stepped closer. "You needed to do this yourself. I couldn't do nothing." They stood in the gentle glow of the string lights, the city rumbling overhead. I have a proposal, David said. Not as your boss, not as charity, as partners. He took a breath. The Anita Foundation, a real organization. You lead it, you make every decision. I provide resources, connections, funding, but equal voices, equal control. You built this. I just want to help you build it bigger. Anita studied his face, searching for the catch, the hidden agenda. But all she saw was a man who'd been changed, humbled, made human again. Equal, she asked. Equal, he confirmed. She extended her hand. David took it and they shook, not employer and employee, but partners. Then Anita stepped forward and embraced him. David held her, feeling something in his chest crack open, something that had been closed for far too long. Thank you for seeing me, she whispered. Thank you for teaching me how. 6 months later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony drew hundreds. The Anita Foundation Community Center stood where an abandoned warehouse once rotted, bright, clean, full of hope. Former street children wore school uniforms, backpacks slung over their shoulders. Parents wiped away tears of gratitude. David and Anita stood side by side on the small stage, their hands almost touching. Not quite holding, but close, always close now. A small voice called out from the crowd, "Miss Anita, Mr. David, look what I wrote." A boy ran forward with a paper covered in careful handwriting. Anita knelt down, reading his words, while David watched with a smile that had become familiar. They were building something beautiful together, not his vision or hers, but theirs. David thought he'd catch a thief that night. Instead, he found his humanity. Anita thought she had to walk alone. Instead, she found a partner. Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who can teach us the most about what really matters. This is their story, a lesson in humanity we all need to learn.